It is Ukraine that has stipulated that it will not negotiate with Russia, not Russia. Russia has never refused to talk because it knows very well, and this is a basic tenet of diplomacy, that to talk is not to agree. To talk is to present your viewpoint and your reasoning to the other side and to hear so you can find some common ground that will enable an amelioration of the situation, even if not. The purpose of diplomacy is not to reach an agreement, by the way. As a diplomat, my mission was to advance the interests of the United States that were in my charge. Sometimes that meant not having an agreement. Sometimes it meant having an agreement. So the notion that somehow the only way you can be dignified and forceful in defending your interests internationally is to send in the Marines, drop the bombs, or in your case, send the Rangers in. This is just madness. It's crazy. And it's getting us into more and more forever wars. That is what the war in Ukraine has become. That is what the annihilation in Gaza has become. That is what Israel's relations with its neighbors have become. That is what we are headed to with China. That is what we have almost achieved with Iran. This is not just a mistake. This is frankly criminal behavior on our part, self-injuring and damaging to everyone else.
You mentioned the issue of April 2022 in the Istanbul agreements. At the UN Security Council just yesterday, Ambassador Polyansky from Russia addressed that very issue.
A new chance for diplomacy appeared after the Russian and Ukrainian negotiators in Istanbul signed a peace agreement that could have stopped the armed escalation already in April 2022. Let me remind you that Russian troops were located a few kilometers away from Kiev at that time and were withdrawn from there exclusively in the order of goodwill, taking into account the progress achieved in the negotiations. It would seem that this is a great opportunity to eliminate this irritant, save hundreds of thousands of lives, and avoid the destruction of cities and infrastructure in Ukraine. But no, the plans of Western sponsors of the Kiev regime, the prospects of reconciliation of the two neighboring Slavic states, in which, for the most part, one people lives, were definitely not included. That is why Boris Johnson, a former prime minister, took part in the Game of London.
Is that just Russia with revisionist history to try to make themselves look good back in that time, or is it the truth?
It's factual. I think when the Russians talk about being, more or less one people with Ukrainians, they're talking about the ideal relationship we used to have with Canada before we decided Canada was an enemy.
And so what does that tell you about the state of Western diplomacy, not just American, that because he's claiming that it was the British that sabotaged that at least moving towards a peace agreement, which could have ended the war there. Do you buy that?
Well, it was certainly Boris Johnson, the then Prime Minister of the UK, who flew unexpectedly to Kiev and reportedly told President Zelenskyy, "You may be ready for peace, but we're not. You should fight on." And remember that our objective, our stated objective, the GAF, in Washington, the GAF is telling the truth. Lloyd Austin, our Secretary of Defense, admitted that our purpose was to weaken and isolate Russia. We weren't there to save Ukraine from anything. We certainly didn't save any Ukrainians. There is a great deal of complete disinformation in our media about level of casualties. Our estimates of casualties are drawn entirely from Ukrainian propaganda, which greatly exaggerates Russian casualties and minimizes its own. There are actually no figures that we've put forward on Ukrainian casualties, but we accept the Ukrainian estimates of preposterous numbers of Russian dead. There are institutions that count the dead using satellite photography and the observation of graveyards and the like, and monitoring public media in other countries. people lamenting the loss of a father or a son on the battlefield. And their estimates are nothing like what we have convinced ourselves is happening. So, yes, I don't think Ambassador Polyansky was making, I don't think he's a graduate of MSU.
He doesn't appear to be. Someone else who's apparently not a graduate of MSU, making stuff up, is his boss, Vladimir Putin, who, while Polyansky was talking about the April 2022, you had President Putin yesterday also talking about the issue from the diplomacy he offered in summer of 2024.
Yes, they are still the same. The goals of Russia remain the same, but until then, we've been told it's unclear what Russia wants. Well, we formulated those goals last June last year, at a meeting with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The most important is to eliminate the root cause of the conflict. And of course, there are humanitarian issues, security issues in the broad sense.
It's often claimed in many Western and United States, especially quarters among opinion leaders and officials, that we don't even know what Russia wants. We keep having these negotiations. Trump has tried 4 or 5 times, he says. We were so close to a deal, and then all of a sudden Russia backed out. Who's telling the truth here and who's not?
Well, first of all, the Russian objectives have been entirely transparent, not just from December of 2021, when they actually presented a draft treaty to us, which we refused to discuss. But they have not varied. The only change has been that as they have taken territory in the Ukrainian east, the 4 primarily Russian-speaking oblasts, Lugansk, Donetsk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia, have now been formally annexed by Russia, ostensibly to protect the Russian speakers there from persecution by Western Ukrainians. There's no indication, by the way, that anybody in those regions, those oblasts, really wants to be part of Ukraine. We might pay attention to that. But the second point is that Antony Blinken, our Secretary of State, in his 4 years in office, never once visited Moscow. He never had a meeting with Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, except a brief, 5 or 10 minute encounter at the margin of international conferences. Sergei Lavrov has not been in Washington in 6 years. So if we want to know what the Russians want and think, maybe we should talk to them. And actually, Steve Witkoff is off to Moscow after making his political theatrical performance in Gaza. And presumably he will talk to Vladimir Putin, who's been quite open to receive American envoys whenever they turn up. It is interesting that Mr. Witkoff goes into those meetings. This is again a comment on diplomacy, with no staff, no interpreter. He relies on the Russian interpreter. If he makes notes, he makes them to himself. He doesn't speak Russian. He's not familiar with the issues in Eastern Europe, although he's learning on the job. There's no record of what went on in those meetings. He comes back, he talks to President Trump and tells him what he thinks happened. He's a smart man. I'm sure he does a good job at that. But who knows what happened in there? Did he get it right? He doesn't speak Russian. He doesn't have anybody with him who does. So it's not surprising to me that his batting average as a diplomat is 0. 0. And I don't see any prospect of it changing. Finally, I just note that President Trump has focused on the issue of ceasefire. The ceasefire, is something that you ask for if you're losing a war. You don't ask for it if you're winning a war. Russia is not asking for a ceasefire. If it has, in fact, lost anything like the number of people in this war that we attribute to it, then it's not going to give up on those sunk costs. It's not going to stop the war for nothing. So if we don't address the questions Russia has raised, and we should not be afraid of addressing the quite difficult questions posed by others. We should have the courage to do so in light of our own interests. If we're not going to address those issues, this war is a forever war, and it will be settled entirely on the battlefield on Russian terms. Because as we speak, there is a broad advance, belittled in our propaganda, tiny advances along the front. Many tiny advances add up to a big advance in overall. And so Ukraine is falling apart. Mr. Zelenskyy, who is widely suspected of being corrupt, tried to end the effort to end corruption in Ukraine. He faced popular protests. He had to reverse course embarrassedly. He's operating a police state, not a democracy, and it's an extremely corrupt one. It wants to get into the European Union. Lots of luck, because the accession process would require Ukraine to fundamentally transform its political system and embrace democracy and the rule of law, neither of which are present. Second, President Zelenskyy's own military and intelligence people seem to be far more realistic than he about what is happening on the battlefield. And finally, and probably this is the biggest threat of all, President Trump, although he wavers, can't figure out quite who to blame for not surrendering to his ceasefire proposal. He's down on Zelenskyy, now down on Putin too. And he's just threatened President Putin that, August 8th, if President Putin hasn't surrendered to his ceasefire proposal, he will do something. Have a fit of pique? Throw a tantrum? What will he do? This is not impressive on either the hard power or soft power side.
And, speaking of that, just last night, President Trump was asked, is that August date deadline firm this time? Because it's already changed quite a number of times already this year. Here's what he said.
The president is also doubling down on his August 8th sanctions deadline.
Yeah, we're going to put sanctions. I don't know that sanctions bother him. They know about sanctions. I know better than anybody about sanctions and tariffs and everything else. I don't know if that has any effect, but we're going to do it.
I mean, let's just look at it, first of all, at face value. If you don't think it's going to work, and you, quote, know all about sanctions and tariffs, then why would you be doing it if it's not going to accomplish your objective?
No, again, this is performative behavior. It's all for domestic effect. Maybe he thinks Europeans are dumb enough to believe that sanctions against Russia would actually produce something. I mean, we have had the most extreme sanctions in history against Russia for the last 3 years. What have they accomplished? We convinced ourselves for a long time, and with the help of MI6, the British intelligence service, that Russia was running out of ammunition, tanks, aircraft, etc., that the Russian morale was plummeting, that Vladimir Putin was in danger of being overthrown, that the Russian economy was collapsing, tanking, and so on, all of which turned out to be the exact opposite of the truth. Russia is now producing far more than enough drones and munitions to step up its offensive against Ukraine and to continue it for years if necessary. Its economy has overtaken Germany as the largest one in Europe in purchasing power terms. Of course, there's nothing rational about measuring the size of economics in terms of nominal exchange rates, which reflect all sorts of extraneous factors and distort things terribly. If you go to Moscow, which I haven't done for quite a while, I'm told you will see a very prosperous first world city with a lot of rich people and a lot of conspicuous consumption. And I have to say that I think the Russians have a severe problem, even more severe than ours, in that their plutocrats have a bigger slice of their economy than ours do. But we're working on catching up with the big, beautiful bill and tax policies, which basically assume that we can borrow money forever without ever repaying it.